Good evening and welcome to the Modise Network. In the show tonight, I'll be discussing the influence of media on political and cultural developments of our society with media executive Kanten Pillay. And later, former ESCOM chief Matsela Koko explains his time at the utility and his current opposition to the IPP agreements. Welcome. The media as an institution and as organizations and professionals has recently come under the spotlight for mostly all the wrong reasons. Recently, the leading newspaper, the Sunday Times, has had to apologize for a series of articles it published a few years ago that led to the dismissals of several people at the South African Revenue Services. A few journalists were let go by the paper. There are also other new influences driven by social media, which include the phenomenon of fake news. But the media continues to play a critical role of holding power accountable and informing the public and the world about developments in human civilization. Yesterday, South Africa marked the 41st anniversary of the Black Wednesday, when several newspapers were banned by the apartheid government in 1977. But since 1994, the media sector has grown in different directions with new commercial and community radio stations, newspapers and TV stations, and the digital media. One person who has seen it all over the years is Kanten Pillay, who has been journalist, technology expert, and executive with different companies, including this one. And also remember to interact with us using the hashtag the Modise Network on social media. Kanten, a pleasure to talk to you and have you join us on the program. I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much.
That you've made to be with us here. As I said to you earlier before we started the show, that you've been and seen it all, right? And we now have even the current issues. You started how many years ago?
1980, I started off as a print journalist.
Yeah.
It was when I was expelled from the University of Durban-Westville. And, as is the case back then, there were people who actually mentored me in the basics of journalism. There was a gentleman named Farouk Khan in the Post newsroom who taught me the inverted pyramid. And I spent the next few years as a journalist. And yes, since then I've ended up working pretty much in every branch of the media.
Sure, and I will be touching on some of those branches. Some have gone on to become household brands. You know, ETV is one of them, YFM is one of them. But let's talk about the most current situation regarding the Sunday Times. As somebody who reflects on these things, and you've seen the stories been out there for several weeks now, what did you think? What did you make of the way the newspaper was handling the scandal?
I think in the first place, I take my hat off to the editor for having been as upfront as he has been in tackling the problem head on. It's a rare quality in the media these days to actually acknowledge a fundamental sense of culpability. Media ultimately is all about credibility, and I think the credibility of the Sunday Times has been shattered over the period. But I also think that that crisis of credibility then spills over onto other parts of the media as well, because there is this halo effect that comes from the fact that you have a significant player that gets tarnished, and then the shadow of lack of credibility falls upon the rest of the players as well. So I, for one, was very impressed at the way in which the Sunday Times responded to it. They ticked all of the boxes that I was looking for, which was firstly accountability, secondly reaching an agreement clearly with the journalists that led to the scenario in the first place. So certainly, at a personal level, I will be changing my mind in terms of whether I'm reading the Sunday Times going forward. Sunday Times used to be, when I was a young journalist, an absolute must-read. We used to queue up on Saturday night waiting for the paper to come out so that we could read it.
But you know, I understand what you're saying, because you've got choice and you can think about it and do what you say you're going to do. But it's not like the media generally, and when we say media, we generalize, right? We've got different types. I've referred to some of those. We've got the newspapers, you've got radio, you've got television, you've got now social media or digital media. Well, digital media as well as social media. But it's not as if the collective or the individual media organizations that make the collective actually operate according to the same principles?
Well, in theory,
or stand for the same values?
Well, in theory, we do. Print media technically is covered by the Code of Conduct from the Press Council. Well, admittedly, with the notable exclusion of independent newspapers who withdrew a while ago. Broadcast media is covered by the Broadcasting Code of Conduct, which again puts down rules of engagement. But just simply having the framework that people agree on in principle doesn't really translate to implementation. And I think that tends to vary from one institution to another. I think the fundamental thing is newspapers and broadcast media, digital media, whatever it is all about credibility. And at the point at which you lose that in one instance, what happens?
I understand. It's the point I'm making is I want to relate it to the 41 years ago incident of 1977 when a dozen or so newspapers were banned in the country. But it does not follow that all media were banned, right? And there are other newspapers that remained and continued to publish. And, of course, the SABC then also continued to cover the news. We did not have independent radio stations, for instance. And that tells you the story. There was a reason why the other newspapers were banned and the others were allowed to operate, isn't it? Because they were pursuing different agendas.
Absolutely correct. But if you take the banning of the World and Weekend World, at the time I think the Weekend World was pulling a circulation of about 400,000. It was massive. Now, almost without exception, apart from the editor who fled the country at the time, all of the staff moved across onto Post, which then became a daily, which effectively took the place of the World. But the circulation of Post at the time was about 220,000 and never got beyond that. And then when Post itself was banned in 1980, again the same situation happened. Almost the entire staff moved across to the Sowetan, but suddenly the Sowetan circulation was sitting at around about 80,000. So effectively, with each transition, people were aware that we're not going to invest our time in this anymore because...
Here's the point, though. I mean, the political powers that be of any particular time do have an influence on how the media works. I mean, the Afrikaans newspapers, for instance, were given an opportunity to start a broadcasting operation, Amnet. When was this? Was it in the early 80s?
It was in the early 80s, yes.
And they never suffered the problem of being banned and losing circulation and all of that. And of course, that was part of transformation. I'm just demonstrating that you know, sometimes certain things happen, but the readers
but the circumstances were very different under the apartheid regime. You clearly, under the apartheid regime, we had a situation where, for example, during the state of emergency in 1986, where we had policemen standing next to the presses and pulling off stuff and then stopping the presses when they didn't like things that were being published.
It took courageous publications that were independent to continue telling the true story of South Africa and what transpired. 1994 came, and we saw the emergence of new players, especially in the broadcast arena, with new licenses being issued, and some newspapers continuing and others folding, notwithstanding the fact that we were now free and becoming an open society. What do you think of that dynamic? Well, one would have thought that newspapers such as Vrye Weekblad would have gone on to become popular, or even the then Weekly Mail, now today Mail and Guardian, would become one of the leading newspapers. But that was not to be. The Daily Sun, which came after, does not touch on those types of issues, is now the leading newspaper in terms of circulation.
It absolutely is. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The one reason, of course, is that during apartheid, for the majority of people in this country, the only credible source of information was newspapers. You could not trust the broadcast media. However, you suddenly had journalists who had been part of struggle journalism, for want of a better word, moving into broadcast media as of post-1994. Brajo Tlolo being an example, my late friend Amin Akalwaya being another case in point, Zwelakhe Sisulu, who was my president in Mossad, moving now to become the chief executive of SABC. And suddenly that meant that the broadcast media in the country actually picked up credibility, because these were credible individuals who were now running them. And that meant that the dependence on newspapers to actually provide the type of information that we were looking for was no longer there. So the exposés that the Weekly Mail used to do, and the Weekly Mail was a tower of strength for independent journalism during the apartheid years, but that role pretty much fell away because you now had credible storytellers in the broadcast media. So people now had this sense of confidence that we had a free and democratic government, we had credible people running these institutions, and so we switched allegiances.
Now, let's focus on another international story which involves the media, and a very tragic, terrible story of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi who apparently was not even abducted, but apparently killed inside the consulate of Saudi Arabia. You've been following the story, I'm sure, and you see the details as they emerge. What do you make of what transpired there, what the Saudi government allegedly did to him?
Look, people who've been following me on Twitter for the longest time will know that I've always had an intense dislike for the Saudi regime. You know, I consider it from almost every perspective that we can think of, the values that we hold high in our country. The Saudis ride roughshod over it. And so I've been highly critical of the Saudis for the longest time, and this comes as no surprise. What comes as a surprise is the fact that it was as blatant as it was, and again, I suspect that they didn't expect to get away with it. But the number of people who are now acting surprised about the fact that the Saudis are doing this comes from the fact that we tend to be blinkered in our choice of where we get our international news from. And historically, it's an Anglo-centric perspective. So we follow the BBC, we follow CNN because of the fact that they're primarily English medium. We hardly get anything in terms of what China Central Television is saying. Most of us don't take the trouble to find out what India is actually saying or what the Japanese are covering. And their perspectives are very different, particularly around what goes on in the Middle East. So if one had been following, for example, either the Chinese or the Russians, one would have had a very different view in terms of the conflict in the Middle East. And
just a quick question before we go to the break. So for now, you know, for the benefit of our viewers watching now, what would you regard as the most credible source in terms of the coverage of the Jamal Khashoggi story?
I think what's interesting about Jamal Khashoggi is that it's actually forced, for the first time, journalists in the Western media to sit up and recognize what the Saudis have been doing. They've turned a blind eye to it. And you know that as journalists, we hate nothing more than people who actually persecute journalists. Because ultimately, we can't take sides in that battle. That battle is always all about a journalist in any part of the world, irrespective of which side they fall on. Killing journalists, shooting the messenger, it goes against the grain of civilization.
Sure. Well, Kantan Pillay has seen it all. He's my guest tonight. We'll be looking at the key drivers of media, the technology, the commercial considerations, and whether media only chases after scandal, sensationalist type stories. Can it be a source for good? We'll find out in a moment. And of course, share your thoughts with us on social media. The hashtag is the Modise Network.